Okay, so I've got a bunch of people in the chat. Welcome everybody. I've got let's see, Jose, Jim, Dilasha. I'm not sure who Barbie Gummy Bear is, but welcome. Go ahead, everybody. I only see a couple of y'all in here. I'm not sure if the cameras and mics aren't working. Let's go ahead and do a quick mic check, make sure we can hear everybody, and make sure our cameras are working so we can see who we're talking to, and then we'll get started. Let's see, works on my end. All right.
Radio check, 1, 2, 3.
I hear the four of you just fine. So we'll just go ahead and go from there. All right,
Mic
wonderful.
check.
So I hear you as well. Perfect.
What's up, Toby?
What is going on?
It's Della.
I could tell. I was like, oh man, let's go.
Yeah, it
Okay.
automatically puts a weird name. I don't know where Barbie Gummy Bear comes from.
I don't know, but I thought it was pretty funny. I was like, man, someone has a sense of humor. Okay, perfect. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Xander, go ahead and tell me what exactly is your question, and we can just get right into that.
I used to struggle with the 2D approach. Like, of course, there's this table on the chart with your ground speed and estimate rate of descent.
Mhm.
But I was wondering if you had any tips and tricks on how to actually nail the 2D approach.
Okay, so the question is a two-dimensional approach. As far as we're concerned at least in the FAA, we would call that just a lateral navigation, right? So think your localizer approach, um, think anything that lacks vertical navigation. So any kind of, non-precision approach, right? So there's a couple things that you can look at. I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about some of the tricks that I've learned when it comes to this. So you guys should be able to see all of this just fine. I'm going to erase that. And let's talk about a couple important points when it comes to flying a localizer approach or a non-precision approach. Um, one of the biggest things that I find people they tend to have struggles with is the difference between the DA versus an MDA. This is a common area of struggle. So let's first define this. DA stands for decision altitude. The idea is that if you were on a three-dimensional, right, so a precision approach that has vertical guidance, and you are coming down on a glide slope like this, towards your runway. The runway looks kind of like this, You have, lateral and vertical guidance. The decision altitude, the DA, is the altitude. We'll call this an altitude, let's say, 200 feet above the ground or something like that, is the altitude at which, when you're at this altitude, you must make the decision to either continue and land or execute the missed approach procedure. That's the decision altitude. And I'm going to kind of erase this and zoom in a little bit to give a better perspective of what that really looks like. So let's say that this altitude here represents the decision altitude. This is our DA. And our glide path, looks something like this, we'll say, which is very steep, but this is just an example, right? So our glide path looks like this. Decision altitude might be this. If we get to this altitude right here, and we make the decision to either continue or go missed, if we make the decision to go missed, we're constantly descending through this altitude, you see? So we're actually going to end up being slightly below the decision altitude as we dip back down and continue our climb out. See, that's a big difference between a decision altitude and a minimum descent altitude. See, an MDA looks kind of like this, MDA, to where the airplane descends to the altitude and levels off and stays there and never descends below that altitude until they reach the missed approach point, at which point you would go missed. See, the big difference here is that on a decision altitude, it's the point where you make the decision. So there's going to be an area where you're going to be dipping slightly below that altitude in the transition back to the climb. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's why it's very important to, when you decide to go missed approach, you go missed approach. But this isn't the entire point of the discussion, but I wanted to mention briefly that an MDA, you never go below. You never go below the MDA. A decision altitude, it's expected that, if you make the decision at 800 feet to execute the missed approach, by the time you are level and starting your climb again, you might be, at 760 feet before you start turning back up to actually continue your climb out, just because the airplane takes time to stop its descent and resume a climb. But anyway, that is a decision altitude, and those are on, that's going to be your ILS approach is going to have that, and LPV, those type of vertical navigation approaches, and there's some more as well. Now, an MDA is completely different. MDA stands for minimum descent altitude. The idea here is that you will never go below the minimum descent altitude until you have all the required items in sight on the runway, and you can land. Like, you see the lights, you see the runway markings, whatever the list of 11 or so things is, that's when you would execute the missed approach procedure. And that, looks kind of like this. So, for example, if I pull up a procedure here in my iPad, here on the RNAV 17 at Dixon, we have an LNAV approach, so lateral navigation only, and we have a minimum descent altitude, and that minimum descent altitude is 1,300 feet, which comes out to 408 feet height above ground. So this is a common misconception, is this here, this is your MDA, while this number here is your MDH. This is your height above ground. This is your altitude above sea level. Everybody got that? Cool. So whenever I am looking at my weather to see what is the cloud ceiling need to be to make this approach, I'm looking at this number to determine my ceiling, and this number on my altimeter. So, if I have to have at least, a 450 to 500 foot ceiling to be able to fly this approach, because the lowest I can go is 408. So a common misconception on these approaches is people think that they can descend below the MDA, and they cannot. You must make sure you never go below the MDA until you have all those points in sight. And I'll show you what those points are. If we go to documents and we go to 91-175, which I happen to be right next to, because, this is all I do all day, every day, is instrument training, is takeoff and landing under IFR. Now, this is in the FAA, so for our European friends and other parts in the world, this may not apply to you, but you may have some different rules that are very similar. I would imagine it's very similar. So the authorized DA or DH or MDA, for purpose of this section, here we are, operation below the MDA or DA. It says no pilot may operate an aircraft below the MDA or continue the approach below the altitude unless, number one, the aircraft must be in a continuous position to land. So we have to be a stable approach. That's the first thing. Let's see. Why does it say EASA on my screen? I have no idea. That's no idea where that came from. Does someone else have a drawing abilities on here somehow? I don't know. Doesn't matter. We'll figure it out. Continuous position to land, so it must be a stable approach. The second thing is that the flight visibility has to be no less than the visibility for the approach. Cool. This here has to do with category 2 and 3, which we're not worried about. It says here, you have to be able to have either the approach light system in sight, in which case, if you see the approach light system, you can descend down to 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. But you can't go any lower than that until you see the red terminating bars or any of these items here. So I'm not going to list all of them, but it's basically the runway or the lights or markings and things like that. So there's several things you have to be able to see. If you can't see these things, then you have to execute the missed approach procedure at the decision altitude or at the missed approach point. So this is a 91-175. These are things that you will have to know for a check ride and just in the real world. But I have never been asked, well, I have been asked on a check ride, what do you have to see? But I never list, the 11 things. I just say, basically, you need to see lights, you got to see the runway environment is what I say. And I say, if you see the approach light system, you can go down to 100 feet above the end of the runway. But you can't go any lower than that until you see, the red terminating bars or the end of the runway. So there's some of that. Now, this being said, if I go back to my drawing here, one of the common things that I see people do on non-precision approach, a 2D approach, as you said, is they will descend to the MDA and they will level off, and then they will start to get nervous. They think, oh, I am so close to the ground level, and they start flying poorly. This happens very often. They'll start to get a little squirrely, start to kind of do this. They'll zigzag left and right on their course. And of course, the instruments become more sensitive on a localizer or an LP approach as you get closer to the missed approach point, because on a localizer approach, everything funnels you in, right? So it kind of looks like this, and the farther out you are, the less sensitive it is, but the closer you get, the more sensitive it is. So it all funnels you in closer and closer to the runway. I call this the minimums mindset. People get into this mindset when they're around minimums to where they think, oh, I'm so close to the ground, I must be doing something wrong. And really, you're doing nothing wrong. So I tell people, when you get to the MDA, continue flying the proper heading. So fly the proper heading, stay on it, fly the proper altitude. Just stay on your altitude, fly your proper airspeed or whatever it is, and continue flying, with your HSI or CDI or whatever, just fly the course. And when you reach your missed approach point, either it be, a timer, or if it be, something on a GPS, or maybe something on your CDI, like a crossing radial or a DME or something, then you execute the procedure. You want to fly this airplane as precisely down low as you would up high. So make sure you don't get nervous just because you're low to the ground. Now, I also understand that when you're low to the ground, there may be some terrain features and different things that, may cause, the wind to blow across and cause some turbulence and things like that can happen too. And it can be bumpier as you're lower to the ground just because of the friction caused by the surface of the earth. But more often than not, it's not enough to mess the airplane up. So you just have to have the discipline to continue to fly precisely, knowing that, you may only be a few hundred feet above the ground. This is the place where it's most important to fly precisely. And you know what? If you don't like it, you can just as easily execute the missed approach procedure and try something different. So that's my first tip, is don't get into the minimums mindset. Get to your MDA and stay there. There's also nothing wrong with leveling out slightly above the MDA, say, plus 50 feet or something like that, just to give yourself a little bit of a cushion. But don't feel like you can't fly at MDA. Now, a lot of you may have experienced in your flight training, your instructor may have said that if you ever go below the MDA without seeing the runway, it's an automatic fail on your check ride. They always say, oh, it's an automatic fail. I'm here to tell you right now, if you go below your MDA on a check ride, it is not an automatic fail unless you fail to correct it and recognize it immediately. There's an examiner, a friend of mine, that said that she was giving an instrument check ride, and the applicant went, flew below the MDA, maybe 50 feet, 100 feet or so, because I think he was trying to tune his radio or something and got distracted. And as soon as he noticed, oh, I'm below the MDA, oh crap, immediately pushed the power in, pitched the plane up, and got back above the MDA. And so the approach, and he ended up passing the check ride because he recognized that he was outside of tolerance. And since he was outside of tolerance, he recognized it and he corrected it, just like we do at any other point in the test. So don't fret if you're 20 feet below the MDA, so long as you immediately get back up. This is really important for your tests. You want to have verbal corrections on your check rides, verbal corrections, because the examiner does not know what you're thinking. They can only know what they see you do and what they hear from you. So I always say I'm low and correcting, or I am high and correcting, or I'm left, of course, right, of course, fast, slow. I'm pitched up, too high, too low, whatever. I'm this and correcting. If you say, I am blank and correcting, it doesn't matter how far off you are, generally speaking. I mean, if you're 1,000 feet off on a 1,000-foot pattern, you're probably, up a creek, right? But hey, if you say I am, blank and correcting, you're gonna be okay on the check ride. The issue is if you don't correct your mistakes. And if the examiner knows that you recognize a problem and you are working to fix it, that gives you more points. So anyway, there's that. Back to the idea of two-dimensional approaches, LNAVs, localizers, whatever. Another common thing that I found people do on lateral approaches is they have a hard time remembering their missed approach point. Like, where do I go missed? Because on an ILS, it's very simple. You get down to the altitude, and then you go missed. It's an altitude-based missed approach point. But we don't have that on an LNAV or a localizer. So we have something different. Typically, the missed approach points that you might find on a localizer approach or an RNAV approach or something, VOR, the first one is usually time. So you will time from the final approach fix, time from FAF. I'll show you an example of what that looks like. Let's go to airports. We will go to an airport that I actually flew this approach on my instrument check ride, and I almost failed the check ride because I forgot to start the timer. This was back when I was doing my instrument training, so I can attest that this is an important one. So as you can see, the initial approach fix here is Inika. We'll fly to Inika. We would complete the course reversal if required, and then we would fly in from Inika to Jogna. And Jogna here is, as you can see, the final approach fix. But then, as you can see, once you're coming down the localizer, there is no particular missed approach point that you can see. There's not a DME, there's not a GPS, a radial, or anything. So what you do is you go to the bottom of the airport section on your FAA chart. Now, for the Europeans in the room, you'll see that you would have it in a different location. It may not be in this exact spot. This is an FAA chart. However, the concept is still the same. On our FAA charts, we would go down and it would say final approach fix to map missed approach point. It's 5.5 miles. So you would time that distance based on your ground speed, which you could do manually if you were so cautious to do so, or you could just look at the number. And most of us are flying at about 90 knots, wouldn't you say? 90 knots final approach speed. So that's a ground speed. It's very important. That is ground speed right here, not airspeed. So make sure you can adjust slightly for that. But what I would do is when I cross my final approach fix, I start a timer immediately for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. When that timer expires, I should be right here and I'm now ready to execute the missed approach procedure. Pretty simple. That's one of the first ways that you can find a missed approach point. Another one that is common is simply through the GPS. GPS waypoint. Very simple. Your GPS says you have crossed this waypoint. It is now time to execute the procedure. Cool. A third way of telling a missed approach point is DME. When the DME reads the certain number on the procedure, it is time for you to execute the missed approach. So a good example of that, let's use John Tune Airport. These are all airports that I fly to all the time, so it's easy for me to pull them up without having to think too much, which is good because thinking kind of hurts, you know? So I like to keep it as little as possible. So here on the localizer approach for John Tune, because this is a localizer as well as an ILS, but for the localizer, the missed approach point is at the end of the runway. Now you're wondering, well, how do you know that? How do I know the missed approach point is at the end of the runway? Well, the reason is because on any approach where there is both lateral options, like just a localizer, as well as a localizer and a glide path, the missed approach point will always show on the FAA chart. Now, on a Jeppesen chart like you guys use, it's different. But on an FAA chart, it shows the dotted line from the decision altitude right here. But whenever you are trying to figure out the missed approach point on a localizer, you would simply use whatever the last of these lines is, in which case, right here, the end of the runway, 1.1 DME from the John Tune localizer right here. So when the DME says 1.1, I would go missed. Now, I don't have a DME in any of the airplanes that I fly. Well, how can I shoot this approach? Easy. This also works on the GPS. The GPS waypoint shows when I am at 1.1. So it's very, very simple. So DME is an option. Another option is a radial. You might cross a certain radial off of a different VOR. So I'll draw this out here. Let us say that there's an approach that's going into an airport, right here, and there's a VOR, say, over here, and the VOR radial crosses over here to show you your initial approach fix, maybe, and then there's maybe a hold there or something like that, and then maybe your final approach fix, it would show right there, and then your missed approach point might be, a radial right here, and as soon as you cross that radial, well, you go missed, just like that. So that's why you would have two VOR receivers in the plane that would show you exactly where that would be. So a radial is an option. A fifth option for where your missed approach points might be. Go ahead, Xander.
I just have a quick question. Do you look at the tail of the radial, or do you like twist to get it centered for every time you go to the next point?
So if this is the 270 radial, I just plug in 270 on my CDI and wait, and when it centers, I go missed.
Yeah, that makes more sense to me. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, it's way easier than turning the knob the whole time, It's way easier than doing that. That would be a pain. So that's what you would do. The fifth option is station passage. Station passage. Those are two words we don't hear very often. Well, what is a station and what is passage? It's very simple. Let's say we're flying a VOR approach. And there's a VOR approach that I have in mind because I've also flown this on a check ride, as you can imagine. If I go here to this airport in Clarksville, Tennessee, and I look at the VOR runway 35, we can see here the initial approach fix is the VOR. We would go out, do our course reversal, come back in, and we would level off at our, we'd level off at the MDA, and then we would fly that until we cross the VOR. Once we cross the VOR, the flag, flips from a to indication to a from indication, and we would go missed. Does everyone understand? Everyone completely understands the idea of station passage to and from on a VOR, right? So it's all pretty simple. But that's a very common way of doing that. I'm trying to think if there's any more. Let's see, DME, radials, station passage, GPS points, time. Of course, altitude if you're on a ILS or something, but we're flying non-precisions. So DME. And also, I'm going to say radial could also be a bearing as well. So if you are using an NDB or an ADF, for example, it might be a bearing instead of a radial, but the concept is still the same. Most approaches have the missed approach point usually pretty close to the end of the runway. However, some approaches do not. I'm going to pull up an example of that. Gerardo, go ahead.
Hi, Toby. With regard to that, isn't it a little bit risky? I've never done an approach with a passage VUR as my misapproach point, but in this case, you will be at the half of the runway, right?
Yes, but at that point, you're probably going to be circling anyway. So that's a great.
There is no way that you are descending above the runway at a certain altitude, and you are waiting to be at the half of the runway. And then if you see the runway, you just go down because you wouldn't have the enough space to make the land, right?
Sure. Let me show you an example of what this looks like. So here is an example of a runway right here. And here is a VOR. And let's say that the approach course is something like this. And you're here, at the MDA. Right? So let's say you're flying along, everything's great, flying along, and then you don't see the airport until you're right here. And you look out your left window and you see, oh, there's the airport right there. Yay. What am I going to do? Well, you're here at the MDA, you might be around 600 AGL maybe.
Mm.
You're pretty low. At this point, what do you do? And the answer is you circle. So this runway, let's say this runway 36 right here, 36 this way. What I could do is I could simply join the upwind, crosswind, downwind, base, final, and land on 36. But I would do it at 600 AGL.
Oh yeah, that's right, because in those type of approaches, it is not aligned, right?
Exactly.
Was forgetting that.
Exactly. So sometimes that happens. Remember, guys, the whole point when it comes to flying approaches is to get you down below the clouds. Because see, if the Earth is right here and your runway is, like this, let's say the cloud deck is, I'm gonna change the color of the pen to make it look nice. The clouds are, right here, whatever height, they are. Your whole goal is to find a way to get below the clouds so you can see the airport. Exactly. Once you get low enough, let's say the MDA is right here. Once you get down to the MDA and you're now out of the clouds and you're level, it's now a matter of, your eyeballs look down and say, oh, yay, there's the airport. Yay, whatever. You smile, and then you would circle around and come in and land.
Okay, I got another question.
Sure.
With regard to the DME as your misapproach point, you meant to say you were 1.1 miles from the end of the runway. You meant to say from the beginning in this case, if you are facing the runway, right?
Yeah, it's just the use of my English. It was just the you could say the end of the runway, the beginning. I understand what you mean. I was saying I was calling this end the end of the runway. Technically, it's the beginning of the runway, but it also
Got it.
depends on if you're coming from this side. I was simply meaning the threshold.
Okay, got you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good question.
Thank you.
But in that case, that 1.1 miles is actually 1.1 miles from wherever the DME antenna is. So, the DME antenna might be sitting, DME might be sitting, right here. So I might be, 1.1 miles from this antenna, right? But that's 0 miles from the end of the runway. But the point is you simply fly whatever it says to fly here. So here's a good example. This is the localizer DME approach into Aspen. This is one of the most complex and difficult approaches to fly on the planet. I flew it in the citation on the simulator the other day just for fun to see if I could do it, and I did it successfully, but it was not pretty. I'm kind of embarrassed about how bad that was, but that's okay. So you fly from Red Table down, you fly the approach in, and the missed approach point is Aspen 4 DME. So the localizer DME, 4 miles is the missed approach point. But look at this. You're still 2.6 miles from the end of the runway. The missed approach point is almost 3 miles from the airport. Because if you wait until you are at the end of the runway to go missed and you try to make this big turn, you're going to hit a mountain.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy. So you actually have to have a lot of visibility to shoot this approach. In fact, look here. In the citation, our minimums are 10,220 and 3 miles. We have to have a ceiling of 2,400 foot ceiling in order to fly this approach or to get to below minimums. So it's a nice, cool VFR day in Aspen, and we're having to shoot an approach. So that's just an example of that. And check this, 6.59 degree glide angle from the final approach fix. It's very steep. And if we look at that 6.59, I'm flying the citation at 120 knots ground speed. Technically, it's probably closer to 130, but let's just say 120 to make the math easy. I can go to Documents in ForeFlight, FAA, Digital Terminal Procedures, and I go to the very end where it shows my climb rate to descent table. It's the very last page on ForeFlight. This is for the FAA stuff. I find my ground speed of 120. I'll just draw a line straight down from there. I look on my angle and I try to find 6.59. The highest I can find is 5.17. It doesn't even go that high. So I think, well, how do I make this work? So 6.59 is close to, say, 6.6, right? We'll call it 6.6. Half of 6.6 is 3.3, which I can find right here. So 3.3 would be a 700 feet per minute descent rate.
Times 2.
Times 2 is 1,400. So I would have to descend at 1,400 feet per minute from, where'd it go? From Doipi, 1,400 feet per minute to make a stable descent to the runway. This is pretty crazy because in the jet, we're not supposed to go above 1,000 feet per minute unless it's for a different reason. But anyway, I didn't want to spend that much time talking about that, but these are some examples of things that I found people have problems with on these two-dimensional approaches, because really, especially Xander, back to your original question, how do we fly these precisely? Really, you fly them precisely as you fly anything else. I find the most common problem is people getting into that minimums mindset and they get scared because they're flying so low to the ground, when really you just need to fly as precisely as you would anywhere else and not worry about the ground. As long as your altimeter is set correctly and you are using the correct chart that shows the correct altitude, you should be, a certain height above the ground. and not have a problem. So minimums mindset combined with not going below the minimum descent altitude, and if you do, correct immediately. Add that to verbal corrections to yourself. I'm low and correcting, I'm high and correcting, left and correcting, right and correcting. As well as knowing where the missed approach point is critical. Those are some of the biggest points. I'll give one more tip on this, which actually applies to everything, as well as vertical guidance approaches, which vertical guidance approaches are also very simple. There's 3 additional tips that I have for that. I'm going to pull up a video. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for one moment while I pull this video up. And then I'm going to send it to you guys, but I just want you to see what it looks like pulling it up on YouTube. Okay, perfect. Let's see. Here we are. This video here by Rod Machado called Bracketing the CDI. I'm going to put the link in the chat. I recommend everybody watch this video. But basically, the concept that he's teaching, the concept that he is teaching is that you should be using the attitude indicator primarily with the course deviation indicator, and keep your scan between these two. Of course, you know, watch your speed and watch your altitude, of course, but keep your scan between these two instead of trying to be picky about little numbers down here. Simply say to yourself, is the needle moving left? Is it moving right? Or is it not moving at all? If the needle is not moving, then whatever heading you are holding is the correct wind correction angle, because the needle is not deflecting, it's parallel. So you say, okay, if the needle is, let's say here, I'll try to pull up his video. Let me find this spot. It shows here, in this case, the needle is deflected slightly to the right. It's very difficult to see, but the video link I sent to you guys. The needle is deflected slightly to the right. So in which case, he should roll his airplane about 5 degrees to the right and then immediately roll back to level. If he does that, the airplane will smoothly get back on course. I'm not going to go into more detail on that. I want you to watch this video. This video does the same exact explanation that I teach my students in the real airplane. So there's that. I'm going to go back to my iPad, and I want to show you my tips for holding a vertical track. And then we'll go into some questions and stuff that everybody else has. So those are my tips for lateral. Oh, and one more tip for lateral is careful about this. So let's say you have your final approach fix right here, final approach fix, and then your altitude for that is this. And then after that, you know, you can descend down to, let's say the ground is here. After that, you can descend down to your minimums, and let's say the minimums are here. Whatever this is, the MDA. Most pilots tend to reach their final approach fix and then dive down to their MDA quickly and then level off. This is called dive and drive. The idea is they dive down to the runway and then drive the airplane to the missed approach point. This is not the best way to do this. There's many other ways you can do this to be safer. It is legal, and sometimes I have to do it because the approach is so weird that I don't have the capacity to maintain a consistent, stable approach all the way down. Or maybe it was an approach that I hadn't thoroughly planned because I had to divert somewhere unexpected, and it's easier for me just to descend down to the altitude quickly, not have to think about it, and then just fly the numbers. However, the best thing that you can do is figure out something called a CDFA. That stands for continuous descent final approach. CDFA. It looks like this. Let's say that the runway is here. A continuous descent on final approach is basically figuring out what descent rate do I need to fly to maintain a consistent angle from the final approach fix to the runway. And it looks like that. And what I like to do is I like to tell people, your goal is to figure out what angle that is. Sometimes it tells you the angle, and then to figure out what feet per minute do I need to fly to make that happen. Because if I could just say, oh, at my final approach fix, I need to fly 612, feet per minute. And if I can fly that, I'll be good. And then the point is that once you reach this point right here, where you would be going below minimums if you didn't see the airport, that is called your visual descent point. That's the VDP, which you guys may have seen in one of my other videos, the VDP. This is the point at which if you're at the MDA, and at the MDA, you're on a good glide angle, to the runway. In the jet, I personally recommend if I'm coming in on the final approach and I do not see the runway by the VDP, I'm going to go ahead and level off, or I'm going to go ahead and climb to my missed approach altitude. And then once I'm at my missed approach point, I'll execute the procedure. Because I know that if I get to the jet, I get the jet right here, and I see the runway, I'm going to have to dive way down to get to the runway, and that is not a good idea, especially in a citation. That's pretty stupid. You shouldn't ever do that. Now, I've done this before in a Piper Cherokee. I'd put full flaps and slip. Comes right down. It's beautiful. But it's also depending on the concept of, well, what is the stable approach? What is continuous position to land? For me, I slip every single day. So a slip is not an unusual maneuver for me to accomplish. It's very stable. I can slip all day, but it might cause you to destabilize yourself if you're not as proficient in, say, a slip. And I generally say that if you have to slip, you're probably doing something wrong. So,
But I'm sorry to interrupt. After your BDP, wouldn't it be legal to go down if you see the runway after your BDP? Would it be legal still?
so if you see the runway after your VDP, you can descend, sure. In fact, one of the points about the instrument approach procedure is that the rule actually says that once you get past your final approach fix, if you want to, you can descend down to your minimum descent altitude, and then you can stay there. And let's say you see the airport right here, like right here, you see the airport. It is suggested in the regulations, at least in the FAA in the United States, it's suggested that you continue staying level until you reach the VDP and then descend, because this is your stable approach angle. Because if you were to descend early right here, there may be obstacles and different things down there that you might hit.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're at the VDP, it's basically telling you there's nothing between you and the runway. It's going to be safe getting you there.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I thought the VDP was like the maximum distance of the L that you have to go down if you see the runway. So you can descend after, right?
Yeah, you can descend. You can descend after. And any side on this side of the VDP, you can
Besides
descend.
to the,
No problem.
okay.
On this side, not a good idea.
Thanks.
Yeah. Now, this is not regulatory. This is advisory. It is only advisory. But anyway, I have a video on VDPs you guys can watch if you have any more questions on that, because I want to get some more questions answered before we get done. But that was my last tip on 2D approaches, like lateral approaches, is find a way to calculate your CDFA. And most approaches will have a number, like might say, 3.2 degrees, in which case you take 3.2 degrees and you go to ForeFlight and you go to the very back and you find 3.2 right here. And then you find your ground speed and say, okay, well, I need, 510 feet per minute or something like that. So go ahead, Della.
Oh, no, I just wanted to ask a question after that, if
Sure.
or I could wait for the next person.
No, go ahead.
Right now, or it's different from all the approaches. It's about lost comms.
Okay, let's ask that last then. We'll do that in a minute.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to bust through the rest of these real fast. So those are my lateral tips. And this video is recording right now, and you guys will be able to watch this later. So anyway, precision approach. So we're thinking vertical guidance. Think 3-dimensional. What are the tips, right? Tip number 1. Do this. Here we go. Tip number 1 is going to be performance profiles. Performance profiles. Basically, the idea that pitch plus power plus configuration equals performance. So I know that in a 172, say a Cessna 172S, that is, 2 people and half fuel tank, midweight, a moderately mid-weight airplane, I can fly a 90 knots, 500 feet per minute descent beautifully with flaps 10 degrees at, I think it's what is it, 21? I think it's 2,000 is what I have written down. 2,000 RPM with a pitch angle of -3 degrees pitch. So I know that if I take my hands on the controls of the airplane and I set 3 degrees of pitch at 2,000 RPM with 10 degrees of flaps, the airplane will do this. It will fly 90 knots at 500 feet per minute, which 90 knots at 500 feet per minute is very, very, very close to a 3-degree angle. It's very close. I think 450 feet per minute is technically a 3-degree angle, but 500 feet per minute, it's so close. Who cares? It's basically the same thing. So whatever I'm flying in ILS, I just set these 3 numbers. I don't have to think about what power settings should I use and what speeds. I just do these 3 things, and then this magically happens. That's the backwards arrow. This magically happens. There we go. So that's the biggest point there. Go ahead.
As I think it will work only for if you fly for the same elevations all the time. And
Mhm.
when your elevation becomes higher, you have to take more power.
Exactly. This all works at a um, fixed density altitude and, weight conditions, etc. So this works here for me at an altitude of about, 3,000 feet density altitude at 2,000 pounds gross weight. That's what that does. Now, guess what? If I'm lighter and I am, at 1,800 pounds and maybe, 1,500 density altitude, then I might only need 1,800 RPM to do the same thing and 5 degrees nose down pitch. It might change slightly, right? But what you have to do is go up and record these numbers. You start off with the fact that I know I want 90 knots and I know I want 500 feet per minute. So now, what is my pitch? What is my, oh, and I want 10 degrees of flaps too, because we're flying an approach. We want flaps in. So what is my pitch? And then what is my power? And then what is my, yeah, that's it. What is my pitch and what is my power? You simply record those numbers, and whatever you get, that is what you fly. And you can take that to your next flight. That way, if you notice, let's say you notice that you set 10 degrees of pitch and you set the proper RPM and you set the proper, I'm sorry, 10 degrees of flaps. I'm sorry, that's flaps. You set 10 degrees of flaps, you set the proper RPM, and you set your pitch like you want it to. But you notice that the airplane is, it's holding 90 knots, but it's descending at, say, 700 feet per minute instead of 900 or 500 feet per minute. Well, what's the matter? What's the problem, right? It may be that you're at a higher density altitude. So the temperature may be hotter outside or something like that. Or maybe the airplane is heavier. It could be a variety of things. But these numbers here tell you what to expect on the airplane. It's about what to expect. This is very important. I highly recommend everyone goes out and calculates their own performance numbers. I know what these are for almost every airplane that I fly within a certain margin. So that's the first tip, is to know these numbers, because when you're on the glide slope, all you have to do is set your pitch, reduce your power, and make sure you're configured correctly, and the airplane will automatically level out nicely on the glide path. Tip number 2 for this, and if we go a few minutes over on the time, that's okay. I don't have to be anywhere directly after this, so I have a few extra minutes. This is the evening, so I don't have as much going on. Tip number 2 is this. You all have heard the idea of, pitch for airspeed, right? So pitch for airspeed, right? I don't like using that term, and here's why. Pitch does not always equate to an immediate change in airspeed. Sometimes you actually take the yoke, right? The yoke right here, and you would put your hands around it, and then you would push it forward. And as the yoke is now forward, and this is, out here a little bit, this is the panel of the airplane, the propellers out here, spinning around, whatever, right? As you push the yoke forward, it might take a minute for the airplane to slowly speed up faster and faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. It's not immediate. But if I am flying in a straight line like this, and I take that yoke and I push it forward, someone tell me, what happens to that airplane the exact second I push the stick forward?
More rate of descent.
It goes down immediately. The flight path goes that exact second it goes down. Now, it takes a minute for it to speed up, and over long term, it will speed up. But immediately, its flight path vector changes. So, this being said, it's important to think of this as pitch is long-term airspeed, but short-term, it's flight path, it's trajectory. So, this being said, I recommend using your pitch control, like your attitude. So we'll say here, this is blue, and down here, we'll use brown on your attitude indicator, right? I recommend using your pitch against your glide slope. So pitch for glide slope. And the reason I recommend that is because if you take your fingers and you push forward on the yoke or the stick, the glide slope will immediately begin to climb. Immediately. Or if you find yourself a little bit low, you say, oh, I'm down here. What do I need to do? I'm sorry, if you're low, it'd be the other side, my bad. If you're low, it would be up here. And you say, oh, I need to correct this. I need to fix this. So what you do, you take the stick and you pull up slightly. Now I would add power, of course, I would add power, but just let's say power is fine. I would pull the stick back slightly and that glide slope would, oops, wrong button. That glide slope would immediately come back down to center instantaneously. So if you need quick corrections on your glide slope, I would use your pitch. And then you could use your power for speed. It's actually reverse of how people usually teach it. Now, as I was saying, I recommend, pitch plus power plus configuration equals performance. That's obviously the best way to do it. But if you need a small correction, I recommend pitching for your glide slope. The last thing I recommend is bracketing. And bracketing is in the Rod Machado video that I showed you. Whoops. It's where you use the attitude indicator with your CDI to get a more stable and a more accurate control of your lateral and your vertical. That's what I would recommend for that. So, Xander, did that help kind of clear up some confusion or some ideas on how you can be better at those two things?
Yes, that was very useful, Toby. Thank you for that.
Okay, no problem. I want to answer some more questions before we get out. I know, Della, you had a question, but before I get into your question, I want to see how many others that we have so I can see if more people got helped. Because I know I answered some questions for you the other day and some other people haven't had answered yet. So I know you're stuck with me for a while.
I could go
So
less. I could go less. It's okay.
okay, perfect. Let's see. I've got several others in the chat here. I've got Adam, CJ, Jim, Jose, Juan, Crystal. Looks like it's like Ellie left. So there's several of you. Who has a question that we can get to quickly? Kiro, go ahead.
Yeah, yes. And Toby, please tell, do you think it's use only the power setting for glide slope corrections? Is it ineffective, or especially for jets?
It's effective for anybody, especially for jets, but for anything. I've been teaching this since before I was flying jets, and it's very good. In fact, I might have a document that I can share with everybody. I'll have to find it later, but it's actually a table that it looks kind of like this. It says on this side, things like VY climb. It might say level. It might say descent, and it might say ILS or something like that. And what you would do is you would put in your pitch setting here. You'd put your power or your RPM setting here, and then you put in your flaps, and then so on. And then you would simply fill out all the boxes. And then by the time it's all done, you might have VY pitch is 10 degrees, power full, flaps 0, and it's going to give you an airspeed of 75 with a climb rate of 800 or something. And an ILS is pitch -5, power 1800, flaps 10, speed 90, and descent 500 or something. And you fill out the whole thing and you fly with it. And it's very good. And every day you fly, it may be a little bit different, but this is the best way to do it, 100%. So, did that answer your question?
Thanks.
Okay, very good. Adam, do you have a question?
Can I add something to that, Toby?
Oh, Xander, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yes. No, go ahead, Xander.
It's also very useful in a circuit for it's also very useful for a circuit flying a VFR to do something similar. Just wanted to add that.
Exactly. In the circuit, it is very useful. I know that, right here, a beam, my touchdown point, I want to set, flaps, flaps 1, speed, 90, etc. And I can begin my descent consistently all the way down. It's the same exact idea. So, Adam, do you have any questions?
Yeah, so I guess one of my biggest hurdles getting over right now flying approaches is I'm on the coastal area in North Carolina, and it gets gusty a lot, and just not blowing out of my white arc. Trying to keep my speed up to get through so much of the turbulence, because they say to add increase your speed on your approach speeds, by whatever it is, half the. So if it's 70, half the wind speed, half the gust, you add to your approach speed. So that's what I'm kind of having issues with flying in windy situations. It's not blowing through my white arc.
So that happened to my student 8 times about 2 hours ago. So I
Yeah.
can tell you all about that. So first off, you want to add one half of the gust factor to your VREF. It's VREF. Now, you could add that. I do not add that to my ILS approach or my localizer approach.
Cool.
I don't add it to that. I only add that to my font, like crossing the fence, like VREF. I want to, for example, the wind is 20, gust 30, right? So if the wind's, that's a gust factor is 10, right? Half of that is 5. So I would add 5 knots to my VREF. And VREF, if VREF in this Archer that we're flying is 66 knots, I'll fly 71 knots over the runway threshold. The idea is VREF is actually designed to be the speed that you fly when you are right here, about 50 feet off the ground. This is where VREF, like as long as you, I don't care how fast you are out here, as long as you are at VREF right here, and then you close your throttles slowly or whatever. You don't have to close some airplanes you keep power on. You know how it goes. It's still different. But you would get to VREF there and then, do your thing.
Gotcha. So what you're saying is it's most important to be at that VREF speed pretty much just at that point to deal with your low level wind shear type of thing.
Yeah, basically. Now you're gonna fly faster anyway. So I mean, here's the thing: you're a private pilot, right? So you've already
Yeah.
flown. You've already know how to fly in gusty conditions. So just
Mm.
be smart about, oh, it's a little gusty. I'm gonna add a couple extra knots just because, you know, I don't want to stall it out. I mean, I have stalled airplanes like on final before. It is not fun. It's scary, okay? So I'm
Yeah.
speaking from experience that you want to fly a little faster, but I also fly, tail draggers and tailwheel airplanes and bush flying and stuff where you're just hanging right there. You're just using the throttle. You're just holding to set it right down. It's beautiful. It's so much fun.
Yeah.
Um, but I also do that knowing the envelope of the airplane. I'm very, it's like I can kind of feel it in my rear end. You know what I mean? I can just feel the vibrations of the seat flying by the seat of your pants. It's like, okay,
Oh,
I
yeah.
feel that.
Yeah.
So,
Cool. Yeah. So yeah, I guess it's also I think a mental thing too. Just believing in the instruments, and because when it gets windy, it throws you off, man. It's just like being in the real clouds almost. Um.
yeah, yeah. I did an instrument rating for a guy last year, and he had all but 5 hours were in actual conditions. I did his instrument rating. Get this, I did his instrument rating in 10 days in his airplane, and I had him training on the flight simulator before we started the actual airplane. And by the time he was on his second flight, he could have passed the entire check ride.
Oh my God.
But we had to continue doing flying. The weather was terrible the whole time he was here. So we flew cross countries in the clouds the whole time. We actually had to go mist at some airports because the ceiling was so terrible.
Wow.
So I think we flew, the longest flight that we did was probably 3.5 hours of actual IMC with rain, turbulence. There wasn't any icing, but we had to stay below the layers where there was icing. Um, and I actually have a time lapse. If you go to my other Instagram, because I have two Instagram accounts, on my old Instagram account, there's a time lapse video of us flying a 3.5 hour cross country in and out of clouds, rain. You see us go down, approach lights, go mist, and do all this crazy stuff. It was really cool.
Yeah, that's crazy.
But that answer your question, Adam?
Yeah, definitely. It helped a lot. Part of it's just getting better at flying in IFR real IFR conditions. But yeah, that'll help for sure.
Perfect. Okay. Anybody else besides Della? Well, we'll get to yours before we leave. But does anybody else have any questions, comments, concerns, anything that you really bugging you that you want to kind of get out there before we move on? Nobody. Okay, cool. Last chance. I'm going to ask a couple more down here.
How would you get
Jay.
your ground speed? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, your ground
Uh,
speed?
from your from your ES.
Are you asking how do I get my ground speed from my indicated airspeed?
Yeah, for example, you're shooting that time up those time of approaches when you have to time after passing your final approach fix, and the ground speed and the speed that you see on the charts are the ground speed. So I think that I kind of forgot how to get my ground speed like quickly just by looking at
Sure.
my IS.
Yeah. So if you have a GPS, you can use your GPS if you have one. If you have an iPad with an electronic flight bag like ForeFlight or something, you could use that to give you ground speed. It's close enough. Alternatively, you could use an E6B, either a manual or a digital one, where you would plan out before you fly. You would plan your your winds aloft and all your headings and things, and you could get that. That's more work, but if you really want to know your ground speed, you should plan it out beforehand or use the tools that are in your airplane. Whenever I go fly an airplane that does not have a ground speed or an iPad or something, I will thoroughly plan out beforehand and make sure I know exactly what I'm doing. Like I fly airplanes all the time that don't have GPSs. So it's important to do that. Now, I will say one thing. You can also do some quick mental math in your head. So it won't be perfect, but it will be close. Let's say you're flying on a heading of 360 and your indicated airspeed is 90 knots. And let's say, let's just say your true airspeed is also 90 knots. It's probably pretty close. You're within probably 5 or 6 miles an hour, 5 or 6
Yeah.
knots. So let's just say your true airspeed is 90, and your indicated is 90 at sea level. Well, if you're flying into a quartering headwind of 10 knots,
Oh yeah, that's
if it's a 45-degree angle wind is 75, yeah, 75%. Yeah, that's what it is. If the wind is 60 degrees, I'll draw this out for you just so you can see it. This is actually some pretty cool math. I like math for those of you who don't know. But I call this the clock method. This is actually really cool. This is the clock method. You guys are going to want to write this one down. The clock method. So this is for calculating crosswind components and tailwind components and things. So in a clock, there are 60 minutes in 1 hour, right? There are 30 minutes in half an hour, 15 minutes in a quarter of an hour, and of course, 45 minutes in 3/4 of an hour.
75.
Cool, right? So let's say that the wind is a 10-knot wind. For a 10-knot wind, if it is coming at a 60-degree crosswind, the crosswind component is 10 knots. If it's a 45-degree angle, the crosswind is 75%. It'd be 7.5 knots. It'd be a 7-knot, 8-knot wind, crosswind. If the wind is a 30-degree angle, half of the wind is a crosswind. So it'd be a 5-knot crosswind component because 30 degrees is half an hour. The clock method. So, and then if it's a 15-degree wind, then a quarter of the wind speed is your crosswind. That's how you calculate crosswind using the clock method. And this is all recorded, so you guys can go back and watch it if you lost me on that one. But basically, whenever the wind is 60 degrees or steeper off of your side, then all of that wind is considered crosswind. But if it's only 30 degrees off the side, then half of whatever the total wind value is your crosswind. And you can use that to figure that out, and you can use the math in reverse for headwind. So it's just basic trigonometry for those who like trig. If you don't like trig, then I'm sorry, but I like trig. Trig makes me happy. So, but anyway, that's just a trick you can use for figuring out your crosswinds. I'll say too that that if the wind is 30 degrees off of your side, the cosine of, I'm not going to get into cosines right now. It's in glaze. I'm not going to do that. But for a 30-degree wind, the headwind component is 14% less. So if you have a 10-knot wind off of your nose and it's 30 degrees off your nose, then the wind on your nose is actually only 8 knots. But it's still close enough to 10. So you can just do it in your head and figure out, okay, if the wind's 10 knots and it's 45 degrees off the side, well, that's going to be about a 7-knot wind. So 7-knot headwind, I'm doing 90 knots and 83 knots instead, right? So how close are you really going to get, So
Yep.
there are some tricks, but
Thank you. And what about you have you got one for the gas factor?
the gust factor, yeah, that's just you add 1/2 of the gust factor to VREF.
No, but how do you get your gas factor?
Oh, that's easy. So if the wind, the gust factor is the difference between the steady wind and the gust. So if the steady wind is 10 knots and the gust is
20.
20 knots, then 20 minus 10 is 10. So 10 knot gust factor. Alternatively, if the wind is 15, gusting to 35, 35, minus 15 is 20, right?
Thanks.
So half of 20, or sorry, yeah, so 20 is the gust factor.
Yeah.
So then half of 20 is 10. So your gust factor would be 10 there as well. So you'd fly 10 knots faster on your VREF. So if VREF is 60, you'd fly 70 on final.
Thanks. So
Sure,
for
no
helping me.
problem. Okay, cool. Xander, go ahead.
Can I just make another suggestion for calculating crosswind
Sure, yes.
correction? You can also divide it by 10 and add 2. So for example, if you have 30-degree angle, you can say it's 3 plus 2 is 5, is half.
Nice.
It also works, it's pretty accurate, and it's really easy to do in your head during flying.
That is, I have never heard of that. That is really cool. So you said, so the wind, so let's say the wind is, you said, let's say 60 degrees off. So 60, what was it? You said 60 divided by 2 or divided by 10. What was it?
Yeah, divided by 10 and then add 2.
Divided by 10 equals 6. Plus 2 is 8. Is this the wind speed here?
No, and then just add the 0 again. And then it's the
Okay.
percentage.
Oh, the percentage. Oh.
Or like you can say 0.8 or
Sure,
something like that.
Okay, that makes sense.
It would
That
be
makes
your
sense.
crosswind component.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, cool. Della, you had the last question. We'll go ahead and go with that, and then we will get going.
It's all right. There's two parts of it, but I'll do it all in one. Say, for instance, you're an IMC and you're coming in for approach, say, for example, to Gillespie, and you lose comms, but then you don't see the runway, so you have to go miss. How do you get the altimeter setting, or what do you do basically?
Pray. I mean, you're out of luck. You could use you could use ForeFlight. You could use a variety of different things. If you have, you turn your radio volumes up. That's just going to be one of those things that you have to take a risk on. I mean, there's always the risk. So you can use ForeFlight. You also, in your flight planning, right, you would have already planned out ahead of time. You would have already planned out ahead of time that you're expecting weather to be this at this place. So, I mean, your iPad, your electronic flight bag should show you all those things.
Yeah, basically nothing too crazy. Because I asked you earlier on your Instagram live about Watson, right? So thank you for that, clearing it up.
Okay, yeah, that video, I'm saving that video. That was a good video. Like, man, I was like, you pulled that one out, man.
I asked crazy questions.
Hey, you get crazy answers. That one's going on my YouTube later. I'm gonna have to download that and publish it. Maybe edit it a little bit. I don't know. All right, guys. Well, hey, I appreciate y'all coming out. It's been a really good call today. And we're just gonna go ahead and quit it all out. I'm gonna go ahead and get this thing uploaded. I just uploaded yesterday's call. Just let's see, it actually just uploaded and it's processing now. I'm gonna send you guys the link so you'll have it. And we'll go from there. So there's the link. Also, if you guys could do me a favor and post in the mastermind community, post your comments, any corrections. If there's anything that I said that was incorrect or maybe questionable, like, well, I'm not sure if that's actually right. I want to know about these things because I am not the perfect instrument pilot. I am wrong sometimes. I don't know everything. So if you could do that, that'd be great. But also maybe leave a little message, a little testimonial saying, hey, this really helped me with this. This was really helpful here. Because I'm taking these testimonials, I'm putting them all together, And what I'd like to do is, if anybody can make a quick video with your phone and say, hey, you know, there's a little video of you talking about how the program helped you. Even if some of you who have not joined the paid community yet, or not the paid community, but the paid calls, because this is just a trial period right now. For those of you who haven't done that, even if you never join, having a video where you say, hey, this was really helpful and this helped me here and here would help me as well. I'm able to do this a lot for people and get a lot of people on these really valuable calls, but I can't do it for free forever. So I can always say, hey, here's what's going on. If you want in, let's get in. But
Toby, do you fly at where's your home base airport? Like you stay
Mike
in
02.
Okay.
Mike 02.
Because
We got a
I live all
5,000.
the way. I live all the way in California, in San Diego. That's my home airport, so it's a little bit of a far trip for me. Probably.
Yeah, you're down there in Gillespie. Down
Yeah.
there. Let's see. Do you ever fly to Montgomery? Of course, you'd probably fly to Montgomery all the
Yeah,
time.
I did. I do that. ILS to Montgomery, GPS to Ramona, and back to Gillespie.
What is it? Is it
Just
MIBS?
it's too congested. It's too crazy sometimes. It's really fast. You got to be ahead of the airplane. Crazy.
Oh yeah.
Especially if
Isn't
like
like
you go to Gillespie, ILS, Montgomery, then you do everything else coming back. It's crazy.
yeah, because when you're talking to approach out there, are you on 2435 when you're coming in on that
Yeah.
yeah. So you're talking to that guy. His MVA over there is like 5,000 feet, and the initial approach fix is final approach fix, I think, is 2,800. So we always had to vector guys way out on the localizer. They have to go all the way past that fix. What's that fix? Is it MIBS? Is that what the fix is called?
Mindy?
Mindy, MIBS, I don't know. It starts with an M, but it was a pain in the neck. Every time, yeah, that's it right there. Every time someone requested that approach, I was like, oh, come on. Can't you just fly somewhere else, please? But anyway, but yeah, if you guys could leave some kind of testimonials or reviews or something, that would really help. Because see, I usually do this. I have a bunch of clients that I fly with and people out here locally. That's really good, but it's really expensive for people to come out here and work with me one-on-one. So I said, we'll tell you what, if we can get a lot of people that pay a little bit, it makes it affordable. So, but anyway, hey, I appreciate you guys coming on. I'm putting this video out like right now. So any last questions?
Yeah, one last thing. Hey, the clock method, is this mainly for situational awareness?
Yeah,
Okay. All right. That's all.
that's it.
Cool. Thank you. I appreciate that.
No problem. Well, hey, Xander, Della, Adam, Krilo, and the see here. I got a whole bunch of others down here. Let's see who else we got. Martin, Mario, Juan, Jose, Jim, Gerardo, CJ.
Thank you,
And,
Toby.
hey, appreciate you guys coming out, and I'm looking forward to seeing y'all tomorrow. In fact, the time for tomorrow is it's in the afternoon, so it is earlier, much earlier. We're doing it 11:30 Central Daylight Time, so that comes out to 16:30 Zulu. So much earlier. Some of you may not be able to make it, I understand, but I had a request for an earlier one. So if anybody's able to come out for that, we'll see you there. Go ahead and pop your questions in the community and we'll go from there.
All right.
Nice.
All right. Peace.
Thanks, Toby.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank
Have a
you.
good one.